Okay, sorry about the recording on Friday. I said technical difficulties, but it was a really sort of user malfunction. I hit the thing, and I must have just hit it like really quickly twice accidentally when I hit the button because, and maybe that's the problem with the touchscreen, because when I went to find it on my hard drive, it was like 2 seconds long, right? It had the first slide for like a no sound for a second. So these things happen from time to time. So if you were relying on this for your notes, you might want to talk to a classmate to get notes from Friday's class, because again, sorry about that. It didn't work. So that said, we're on track to get through most of the slide sheet by Friday. We may come up a little bit short. You know, I really wanted to do on Friday, but I don't think anybody can. Does anybody have a class right after this one? Raise your hand. Do you have a class right after this one? Do you want to go to the Smithsonian American Museum on Friday? Look at Thomas Moran in person? You guys don't care. Nobody cares. Would you like? Yeah, we get a taxi cab down there. We'll meet at 12:20 or so in front of the main house. Right, or 12:30, because I have class at 12:15. And we'll go down there, and that means we won't be back right at 1:45. Probably more like 2:30 because of the time down and back, right? And the reason is that some of the landscapes that I want to talk about on Friday, we're not going to see yours, unfortunately, right, Thomas, the one you're working on, or the one you're working on either, but we'll see other ones by then. And they're much better seen in person, right? So I mean, because they're meant to astound, befuddle. So why not meet down there instead of here? We could do I don't know how much the provost will let me do this, but we could do this on a regular basis. Meet at the museum instead of here. Wouldn't that be much nicer? Harder to record and take notes, but it'd be much nicer. Well, think about it. Anyway, so Friday, look for an email from me to confirm. Right? All the details. I got to check with the powers that be and make sure I can do this. If there's money and it's not too late to set it up and blah, 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 blah. But it sort of struck me that it might not be a bad thing to go see some things in person. Like art should be seen, and take advantage of that. So, okay. Check for emails on that. And we should get through most of the slide list, but probably not all of it. And once I figure that all out, based on this field trip, I'll strike through the stuff that we didn't get to, right? So you have a good idea of that. Okay, so we were looking at decorations at the Capitol, and we were talking about some of the ideologies that underscored these different decorations, right? So we'd been talking about particularly that second phase of decorations. There was the early bits that were based on the revolutionary pictures of Trumbull, right? That were really just, standard document, the heroic struggle, blah, 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 blah. And they don't choose the battle scenes. They only choose the sort of peaceful ones for the Capitol, right? Because remember, Trumbull had done that whole series back in the 80s when he was in England, right, under the tutelage of Benjamin West. And they only choose the sort of peaceful ones, the ones that are not about like fighting so much as they are about, resolving. And then that is followed by a sort of second phase of murals that are all about sort of the idea of America, right? The foundation of the country, not as an independent from England, but just the whole idea of discovery, right? And expansion. And we can tie that second phase of decorations into the growing mindset of Manifest Destiny, of the fact that it is part of our destiny as Americans, speaking for the white settlers now, to expand from sea to shining sea. And this will help achieve the Monroe Doctrine, which said that no other foreign country could establish colonies here anymore, right? There would be no further colonization of America, that it would only be the expansion of the original 13 as part of that body, right? And that led then to the Indian Relocation Act of 1830, pushing, which was negotiated, right, with some of the tribal chiefs to push them west of the Mississippi, with the idea that we would keep pushing. And of course, they didn't think it through. What happens when you get past the Mississippi, right, to keep pushing them, right, eventually to reservations. So on the Senate, the pediment above the U.S. Senate shows this sort of idea about the progress of civilization being the progress of white settlers in the continent, right? And it reads right to left. So we have at the very corner, tucked in a grave, and then a mother with a child and a sort of lamenting Indian brave brooding over the fate or lack of fate, if you will, the lack of future. He has his son with their hunting dog has come back from the hunt and is coming and bringing the fruits of his labor home, but he's really looking somewhat longingly at the settler who's clearing the field, right? And we've seen this metaphor of clearing the lands, both positive and negative, depending on the artist, right? So if, for your preservationists like Thomas Cole, right, this is maybe Innes as well. This is a problematic thing, but for industry, it's good, right? So there's clearing the fields, taming it, moving past the figure of America to sort of American progress seen through technological progress, a soldier, a merchant with children, right? A schoolmaster with his pupil. And then in the far left corner, engineering, right? With the cog and the hammer and the anchor. And of course, the bounty of the fields, right? There in the corner. Hey, wait a second. We were going to do the reading for Friday, weren't we? The last, was that this Friday or next Friday? That was next Friday, wasn't it? Okay, we're good. My mind just went, right? Okay, good. So we're still good. I read it last weekend. Nowhere near so hard as the Thomas Cole reading. Really straightforward. It'll be a breeze. I guarantee it. Because it's all about reaping fields. And that's what made, you see, there's my string back out of the maze. How did I get to this was because I saw the reaped field there. And I just read that last night to make sure that it was something that we could discuss and not just me simply explain or try to explain. Okay. Right. So this idea of progress is tied to Manifest Destiny, and it seems to underscore a lot of the images that go into the Capitol from the 1830s onward. Right. And these continue, as you can see, right through the Civil War. And some of the themes that we're talking about here are indeed themes that are going to be developed by our artists while the war is being fought. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind, because when the Civil War, 61 to 65, right, is the dates of the American Civil War. So this is finished, right, and put up while the war is raging. Okay. Another work of art also commissioned during the Civil War, taking up very much the same theme. Westward, the course of empire makes its way. And you can see the title of the picture. I guess if this shows up on the exam, I'll probably have to block that part out, right? But see the scroll at the top around the American eagle, the blue scroll? Westward, the course of empire makes its way, right? I would get tricky with Photoshop and blur those things out so you couldn't see it. It's a huge mural in the staircase of the House of Representatives, commissioned, as you can see from the dates, 1861. And when I say huge, it's 20 by 30 feet, and it fills the entire wall of the stairwell. So you can see from our reproduction here, which I downloaded from the architect of the Capitol's site, the bits on the side actually bend around the walls on either side, right? So there's this frame that extends around it, and the frame actually continues onto the wall as it comes out at you, okay? So that's on either side here. We'll look at this in greater detail, right? But again, this is the idea of westward expansion given visual form. This is Manifest Destiny in imagery. Westward, the course of empire makes its way. The title comes from an 18th century poem In other words, at least 100 years old, maybe even more, is this poem by a bishop, right, a priest named, I want to say priest because priest is Catholic, right, bishop, George Berkeley in England, called On the Prospect of Planting Arts and Learning in America. And here by planting, he means developing, right? And the entire theme of this epic poem is that it's the destiny of Europe. And this was again written in the 18th century, right? This is the destiny of Europe to move westward, right? That's the theme of this poem. And this poem was quoted often in the 19th century when people discussed manifest destiny, when people discussed the westward expansion of the United States. Even though when it was written, it was before the United States existed, right? So it was all about Europe expanding into America. Now it's being used by the Americans, talking about American expansion, right? And the lines that this comes from, I'll quote them for you. Another golden age, the rise of empire and of the arts. Westward, the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts already past, and a 5th shall close the drama of the day. So in other words, this was seen as, we think about time as a series of chapters, right? The poem alludes to the idea that there are 4 chapters of history have already been written. The 5th chapter of history is Europe's expansion into America, right? Or the Americas. Right? And this was picked up then in the 19th century as part of sort of a rallying cry, right? And quoted often in supporting the idea of American manifest destiny, even though it was written from the point of view of the Brits, right? Now, in making the mural, Emanuel Leutze, who's a German expat living here, like our Capitol Dome, Brumidi was an Italian expat, right? He made 2 different studies that led up to the final mural. And the studies are much smaller. They're about like yay, right? This one's in the Smithsonian American Museum, this big. And we'll walk by it, right, on Friday. We'll be focusing on the things, but you'll have a chance to take a look at it quickly. And you can see at the top it has the same scroll, westward the course of empire takes its way, right? The same sort of frame around the side, but here it's flat with the surface. The same sort of framing element at the bottom of that landscape that opens up down below, and the same basic composition, right? Leutze, you might know, he painted Washington crossing the Delaware, that really famous picture of Washington, right? That's him as well. That's up in the Met in New York. So we're going to look at the pictures somewhat more closely as we look at the study, because I have better pictures of the study than I do of the finished work, and they're basically the same, right? So the main picture, the main scene itself, right, the central scene, shows the wagon train crossing the Rockies, right? And we are meant to see sort of coming out of the Rockies. Look at the looming mountains behind them, right? Sort of foreboding, and what a difficult struggle this has been. And we're meant to be seen sort of cresting the last major divide as the wagon trains cross the Rockies, right? So we're meant to assume that they've found a pass through those snow-capped peaks in the background. And it still hasn't been easy, right? And we see them, hauling their way up the hill. Everybody is tired and haggard and often wounded, right? You see a man with his bloody headscarf on here. It's killed horses that have made it in the past, right? Some of them haven't made it through. And so it's caused that damage. Death looks almost like the burial of Christ back here somehow. But somebody who got sick on the trip or wounded. And again, not the first. There's a cross suggesting that this is now a common thing to find here, these images of death. And all of that is to underscore the degree to which this is such a difficult struggle, right? The push westward. So, we're not doing it because it's easy. We're doing it because God wants us to. And it's a difficult struggle, but one worth taking because this is our destiny, right? Hoodoos in the background, that's what you call as rock formations. You see all over Utah, hoodoos in the background. And I don't know if Leutze himself actually traveled, because on a certain level, they're crossing the Rockies here. You can see we got the two guys on the top of the rock that climbed up, and yeehaw, it's almost like land ho, right? They look and they see flatlands ahead, thank God, no more mountains, right? That's sort of the thing. Even though if you've ever been to that area, you know that when the Rockies end, it's not flat, right? There are more hill mountains in the distance, right? There's the Sierra Nevadas, there's the Cascades. It's not over yet, right? And even if you cross the Cascades, it's not over yet, right? There's still more mountains there. It's Coast Range as well. So, or you know, the Bighorns in Wyoming. I mean, these things are still west of the Rockies, right? So it's not that their work is done, but that's what's imagined here, right? Is that there's a, thank goodness we can put this behind us, and as our settler family in the middle, which almost looks sort of like your perfect family unit, right? Points off to the direction. You can see that it's just empty, right? It's waiting for us. Why didn't we think of this before? There's nobody here, and that's part of the ideology, right? Is how does Manifest Destiny work? Manifest Destiny works because we didn't, even though everybody knew about the Indian Relocation Act, right? The bottom line is that most of this land is unpopulated, and it's there for the taking, right? And of course, without the Monroe Doctrine, if we didn't do it, somebody else would, right? So there is this great virgin territory waiting for them out there. We've got our wonderful foreign country. Some people suggested that this was Daniel Boone, although it's not intended to be. But a mother with a child praying, right? The sister, the son helping, and all of them have these sort of mountain men guides with their hats, right? People who know the territory, helping them work their way through it. He's pointing down here, and you almost get the sense that going downhill ain't going to be a whole lot easier than coming up, right? Because it's a fairly steep path down, but they're busy working at it, and they're busy clearing the pathway, which is again exactly the metaphor we saw on the Senate building, right? That's the sign of our progress, is clearing the pathway. So if we go back and think about that Innis picture of the Lackawanna Valley, where we talked about the fact that the clear cutting might be seen negatively because we got so used to it with Thomas Cole. It's also a standard sign of Anglo progress in America, right? It's clearing the way. And we have it here as well as a non-negative symbol of our new presence in this area. So that's our basic scene, right? Coming up over this hump, the difficulty in the rise, the difficulty still ahead, but at the same time, the really hard, heavy lifting, if you will, is behind us, right? No more ice-capped peaks yet to cross. And then around the outside of this, we have this decorated frame. And I'm always kind of drawn to works of art that have their own frame, right? Not a frame that's put on it, but the painted frame, right? I really kind of like these things. And in this case, Leutze has two different kinds of frame. There's a framed picture down below with two vignettes of portraits. And then there's this scroll work around the top. So we'll look at each of those in kind. Down below, we have on the left, and these are labeled for us, there's Daniel Boone as an old man. He's here because he helped explore Kentucky, right? So he's a symbol of exploration, and that's underscoring the theme of the central picture, right? The theme of exploration. So Daniel Boone and since this is just a sketch for the final work, right? It's not really resolved fully, right? Because he's just banging it out. But it is labeled at about the 1 o'clock there with Boone. On the opposite side, Captain Clark. This is William Clark of Lewis and Clark, right? Now from the West, they make us memorize Lewis and Clark because that's why Oregon is there, right? But they discovered the Oregon Territory, or were the first pioneers out there at least, to explore the Oregon Territory in 1804, 1806, right? Was Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, right? And so So this is Captain Clark. Lewis gets short shrift, right? He's not there with him. But you'll notice that his far-reaching explorations have led him to adopt a native garb as well, right, on his head. But they are then both included as representatives of the exploring spirit, right? That idea to push off into unknown territory and claim it for others. Between them is the San Francisco Bay. And in fact, that's the Golden Gate. So that's where the Golden Gate Bridge would eventually be built, is directly across this span. Yeah? So that's a view of that bay. I guess, would that be Alcatraz then? I wonder. In the middle there, that little island that you see might well be Alcatraz. I should look at which way we're supposed to be looking here, right? I don't know San Francisco that well. But again, the idea of that's the port, right? The Golden Gate, the portal to the west. And even further, I guess at this point, the portal to the east, right? Because it's pushing even further. But sea to shining sea. Now, in the scroll work, you see other things appearing, right? Animals and plants. And then, what's that? The three kings from the Bible, right? Who followed the star to find the Messiah, right? Led by God on their international travels. Do we need to sort of drive this home? Explain it, right? This is exactly what this whole point, right? Manifest destiny, led by God to a holy goal. Down below, a pair of images, maybe a bit harder to read. Any idea who that might be? Guy standing there with a stick? People down below. Moses, right? Parting the Red Sea. So we see the waves coming up, the children of Israel walking through on the dry land. Moses held out a staff, and that's what parted the Red Seas. Traditionally, in images going all the way back to the Middle Ages, Moses has horns on his head, and that helps to identify those two things there. Long sword, right? Make it short. Early translations of the Bible, many of them were inaccurate until Jerome, one of the cardinals of the church, came up with the proper Latin translation called the Vulgate that the church still uses today. Okay? Did that in the 4th century. But prior to that, there were multiple mistranslations, and Jerome's job as a biblical scholar was to figure it all out, right? So he was able to read Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and correct these things. And one of the incorrect translations from the book of Exodus was that when Moses came down with the Ten Commandments, the Bible verse actually says that his face shined with the glory of God. I guess something, because he's been talking to the burning bush. Right? But it's not glowed with the glory of God. And one of the early mistranslations said that Moses had horns. Right? And so St. Jerome cleaned that up. But even though it had been changed, people kept the horns as a way of easily identifying Moses. Right? This is a calling card, right? Even though everybody knew better. He was talking to a bush that talks. You know? He just got done talking to a bush, and it gave him some stones with the Ten Commandments on it. And we're worried about horns. It's kind of an implausible. It's a miraculous story anyway. So why couldn't he have horns? Long story short. So Moses leading the children of Israel to the promised land. Again, that exact same idea, right? The destiny of God. You will go. Where are you going? The promised land. Right? And that idea of the promised land we've seen echoed in a lot of other images. Churches, Niagara Falls, right? The idea of the rainbow and God's promise, right? Up above, no longer Christian, but pagan symbolism. This is Jason and the Argonauts from Greek mythology. Jason was charged with sailing to find the miraculous golden fleece, the golden lamb's skin, right? And that fleece is decorated on his sail, and they're now off on a mission given to him by God right? To go and find that promised thing. So every one of these is exactly that same thing, right? Go ye out there, right? Colonize. Upper right corner, that's Hercules. And I don't know this entire story, but he's splitting the Rock of Gibraltar, right? And I don't know the theme behind this, right? But apparently in mythology, the Rock of Gibraltar cleaves, right? They're two peaks. And according to Greek mythology, it was Hercules that split the veil. And we know that's Hercules because he's wearing a lion's skin over his head. That's the standard way of identifying Hercules. And he's holding up his stick to break the Rock of Gibraltar. It must have some travel metaphor because of where the Rock of Gibraltar is, which is right at the mouth of the Mediterranean. Right? It's directly between Spain and Morocco. Right? So you're giving me a look like you might know this. No? Okay. I was hoping somebody out there knew better than I did what the story of Hercules with the Rock of Gibraltar is. But certainly it relates to travel, right? In the same way that the Magi does. And then down below it, we have, after Moses brings the children of Israel through the Red Sea as they're being delivered, right, from Pharaoh. And that idea of delivery, delivery from Pharaoh, delivery from English rule, is also a parallel. But spies are sent out to the Holy Land, and they come back with fruit. So these are the Holy Land spies returning from their expedition with what was out there. And of course, the idea of bounty is key, right? The whole point of spreading out there is to be able to take advantage of the resources that are there. And our Holy Land spies coming back with these massive fruits tie into that idea. Last guy, any guess who that might be down below? Columbus is a good bet, right? I've heard some people say Marco Polo, but I think Columbus makes a whole lot more sense, right? And again, exploration and the foundation of the country, all tying into the theme. And so these are all meant to underscore the main theme in the center, which is that, this is an image of manifest destiny. And of course, it's entirely done in order to decorate our capital, right? As part of the myth of America. This is what America is all about. And in translating it from the study to the final, he made a few little changes. You'll notice, right? Daniel Boone ends up over here. William Clark ends up over there, halfway up the side. The other figures are still there, but rearranged. And we have other travelers' implements, pickaxes and shovels and whatnot, the sort of thing you would need to make the travel down below. We still have Golden Gate in between the two down below, but some slight tweakings to the themes around the frame. And then a few other sort of interesting changes. He adds African-American slave, or freed slave, tending one of the horses in the middle. You see, simply isn't there in the study. And this is because while he was working on it, 1861 his commission was finished in 1862. During that time, D.C. emancipated slavery, right? Emancipated all the slaves. So while he was working on it, the laws of the district changed. And he included this image of, all-inclusiveness in westward expansion to acknowledge the recently freed slaves of the District of Columbia. So that's one small change that he made. Another one, a little bit more obvious for us, something that was, look what happened to the guys on the hill. Instead of just being prospectors out there, who I see it, they're going to plant the flag, right? They're given that American flag that's added to it, because this is the particularly American destiny, right? So that's really much the changes that he makes going to the final version. Westward expansion, like we see in Leutz's picture, increased the demand for rural western scenes back on the East Coast. And when it comes to painting life in the West, Bingham, George Caleb Bingham, is one of the best. And I really like his stuff. I think it's really charming. in a lot of ways. Uh, Bingham grew up on the Lewis and Clark Trail in Missouri. He's painting these scenes based on his recalled experience growing up. There's something slightly nostalgic about them, a lost time of when he grew up out west. And he ends up working for the most of his life in St. Louis, which, if you know, is the gateway to the west, right? Plus the arch in St. Louis. He focuses on what we call genre scenes, and those of you who've had other art history classes know what these are. A genre scene is a scene of everyday life. It's not intended to have a narrative, really. It's not trying to tell a story from a book or illustrate a historical event or a biblical event, right? Nor is it really a landscape. It's a scene of everyday life, a non-newsworthy non-event, right? So you would not call Watson and the Shark a genre scene, even though it's a scene of contemporary life. Too newsworthy, right? You wouldn't call any of the Civil War battle scenes a scene of everyday life, even though it's contemporary life. Because again, it's newsworthy. Everyday life scenes and genre scenes are mundane images of everyday life, right? Not contemporary life, but everyday life. The sort of thing that you would see and not notice, and see the next day and not notice it again. And it calls attention to really contemporary living conditions in the world, right? The contemporary world in a way that newsworthy events simply don't. It recalls what it was like to be alive. Right? Genre scenes. It's a term that goes all the way back to the 16th century. So Bingham is doing these Western genre scenes. This cottage nestled among these trees. You'll notice that the trees have a range of lives from being nearly dead on the right to seeming to overcome death on the left. And it's nestled sort of charmingly there amid the trees. This particular image was submitted to the American Art Union. We've talked about them before. The American Art Union, which was founded back in 1839. Right, little refresher. The American Art Union was founded by art dealers. The whole point was to champion American art, try to direct American art in a positive direction, right? Point them in a positive direction. And so, promoting the particularly American characteristics of American art, right? But it's a group of dealers, and they have members. And by the 1840s, they have like 10,000 members of the American Art Union. Right? People to whom they're projecting their messages about what American art should be. And they have an annual show, and in 1845, Bingham, who's at that point a fairly young artist, submits his first 4 pictures to the American Art Union, and they're all accepted, and this is one of them. Right? So this is his very first submission to the American Art Union, right? Is this particular image. And what's interesting about it and its acceptance by that group is that the year before, in 1844, the American Art Union had issued a statement about American art. And what they had said was they were trying to encourage American artists to make scenes of rural life, right? Scenes of life outside the city, so that the people who lived in the city could enjoy what that's like, could understand how the other half lives, could escape from the city through their pictures, right? The American Art Union says artists should make these. There's a demand for them, and they have a social role to play. They said it in, let's see, it says the paintings provide a country seat in the parlor for those who can't afford a country seat in the country, right? Everybody can be a landowner, if you will. Everybody can have a vacation home through pictures. And so they're encouraging people to make them simply because they said, to the inhabitants of cities, they got a nice detail here, got a couple of nice details of this. To the inhabitants of the cities, a painted landscape is almost essential to preserving a healthy tone in the spirits, right? Art should have this social agenda, if you will, right? Improve the world in some way. And in this case, simply through escapism, helping to improve the spirits of the people in the cities, right? Now, what's also interesting is that they say, how do you do this? They don't just stop with saying, do it. They say, here's some recommendations. So painters should include a bit of landscape with a green tree, a distant hill, a low-roofed cottage. That is exactly what Bingham does the next year. So we think that he was doing, as a young artist trying to get his stuff accepted, was he was listening to what they were saying, doing exactly the kinds of work that they said he should do, right? Direct response to what they had asked for. And it got him accepted. Now, as he turns to these rural scenes of genre scenes set in the countryside, meant to be presented to people back east in the cities, right, to relieve them of the doldrums of city life, he turns, it seems, back to old Dutch paintings from the 17th century. How many times have we talked about the fact that artists in America in the 19th century seem to be deeply in love with Dutch Baroque art, Holland in the 17th century? We've looked at this with landscapes that we've looked at in the past, right? Where our landscape painters are thinking about a Dutch landscape painting because both Holland and America is increasing its territory. Both Holland and America are freely independent from a foreign power, right? That made Holland this rich treasure trove of inspiration. Both Holland and America are primarily Protestant. Right? All of this made it very attractive. And Adrian van Oostade was a specialist in these sort of scenes of country life, right? Around the home, in the tavern, in the countryside, not landscapes, but just genre scenes. And who wants these? It's not a family who owns that house in that yard. They're not the audience for these pictures. The audience for these pictures are people with money, because you're not buying pictures if you're still struggling, to fix the windows, right, in the house. So country images like this are intended for urban consumption and provide for them the exact same sort of escape that Bingham is providing in the 19th century. So I'm pretty sure that he's going back and looking at these things, either through reproduction, right, or I don't know if he traveled. I don't think he did. He's primarily self-taught, which is kind of fascinating. He's a really good painter, considering that he didn't really have much formal training. Right? So, Dutch Baroque art remaining an ongoing influence on American artists in the 19th century. There you go, right? Part of Bingham's interest in genre scenes was based on the fact that other artists had made quite a killing as genre painters. Prior to him picking up the idea in the 40s, there were other artists who had started to paint scenes of everyday life and had done really, really well. Like there's money to be made. It's a successful venture. And William Sidney Mount was one of the most successful genre painters in the decades before Bingham. And his success seems to be, sorry about the typo, his success seems to be the basis for Bingham picking up the idea of genre scenes. The difference is that Bingham's out west. William Sidney Mount is in the east. He lives on Long Island, right outside of New York. Now, that's still countryside, but it's not the West. Whereas Bingham is living in St. Louis. And so when his images come back, they come back to the east with a little bit of added value for being more exotic, right? More foreign to normal experience. You'll also notice that, again, he's placed it outside rather than an interior scene for Mount, right? This one we know is actually a tavern in Long Island because you can see behind the stovepipe, Long Island Railroad, the LIRR, right? The original foundation of the LIRR. I lived in New York, right? LIRR is a commuter rail. It is to them what the MARC train is to us, right? And there is the timetable for the LIRR stuck to the wall behind the man standing by the fire, right? So this is set in Long Island, right? Very, very specifically. So there's a difference between this and Bingham, and that this is an Eastern scene for an Eastern audience, even if it's rural still. Now, William Sidney Mount, making these genre scenes, didn't like explaining what they meant. On the norm, he would prefer to sort of zip it and let people figure it out on their own. He didn't want to, even though he probably had a meaning to begin with, right? He had an idea and sort of a narrative in the back of his mind, something going on in this everyday scene, sometimes maybe with allegorical or symbolic significance, but he didn't like telling people what it was. He was just reluctant to do that. And in this case, we're very lucky because there's actually a letter from William Sidney Mount that explains what's going on in the picture. And the reason he wrote a letter is because the person who bought it wrote a letter to him. This has been lost, right? But he wrote a letter to him saying, this is what I think the picture's all about, right? It got it apparently like all wrong. So Mount wrote back, and this is the letter that we do have. Mount wrote back saying, no, this is what the picture's really about, right? This is what's really going on here. And it was all because the person who bought it didn't have a clue, right? And made it, he didn't want him thinking it was something that it wasn't. So we don't know what the original owner thought. We do know, however, that Mount, for this particular one, explained it. And he tells us, right, that the guy in the back with the hat over his eyes is waiting for the railroad, right? This is a tavern / store near the depot. That's why it has the train schedule there. Place to hang out while you're waiting for the train to arrive, right? Get a glass of whiskey, like the two fellows in the foreground are, right? Sit and relax. Mount got some flack for having it be so empty and spare, but on the norm, these were. This is pretty accurate to what they looked like, right? So the guy in the back with the hat is waiting for the train, okay? And he's not going to leave until the train gets there. Mount tells us also that the man with the pipe is the owner of the tavern, right? So he runs the joint. That's why he's got the wood at his feet. He'll be the one that stokes the fire. It must not be going that much because his glass would probably break, right? And I don't know, maybe he's just warming his whiskey, which people tend to do sometimes, although usually with just their hand, right? So he's our owner of the tavern. And the wounded guy on the left, he says, is basically just a barfly. He's a habitual denizen of this particular tavern. He calls him the barroom oracle, which I love because the oracle is a prophet that lives in a cave in ancient Greece, and he's the barroom oracle, right? The one that will just talk to whomever's there. He said he's the chief umpire during all seasons of warm debate. And this is Mount's letter to the owner. And what he says is he's in the middle of telling the longest story ever. And this is where you might not get this at first, but it's actually really a funny picture, right? He's in the middle of telling the longest story ever. We presume because he's got an injury on his knee. He's got an injury on his head. Although you'll notice there's no blood, right? Which suggests that maybe he's just wearing the bandages to tell the story, right? And the longest story ever is probably the story of how he got to be this way, right? What happened to me? Let me tell you, right? Do you ever watch The Simpsons? You know when Grandpa starts a story and she's like, and ends up like gets lost and there's, and then there was a nickel, right? And that's kind of the longest story ever, right? And everybody in the bar has left except the two people who can't leave. The guy waiting for a train, right? He can't go anywhere because he's waiting for a train. And the owner of the place has got to stick around as well. So this guy is telling this long-winded story. And it's so long-winded that nobody else wants to stick around and hear it. Maybe they've already heard it before. And our owner has got to listen, right? Hope that's okay. And the man in the back looks like he's chuckling a little bit, but the question is if he's laughing because the story's funny, or is he laughing because the situation is funny, right? What's he truly laughing at? And we don't know, but there's humor brought into the scene, right? And that's often the case with genre scenes, that they're not entirely serious, right? That there are elements within them that are supposed to give, chuckle while you laugh. And when we look back at Baroque Dutch genre scenes, almost invariably, these genre scenes also delight you while they teach you. Right? They're meant to teach you a story while at the same time entertaining you. Right? And there's even a Dutch saying for this, right? It's both for learning, education, and for humor. Right? For education and for humor. And that we often learn really well proper behavior from being shown stupidity. Right? By being shown dumb behavior, you realize the moral of the story might be nobody wants to hear your stupid story again, But the only way to get that is to see it in a humorous way. And from our earliest genre scenes on, roughly 1500, we almost always find that within these things there is a level of humor that's used as part of the getting the message across, right? So in this case, it goes back to an old Dutch saying that children will play the pipe following the examples of how their parents sing, right? As the old sing, so the young pipe, right? And the point is that the elders here are setting a really crappy example, right? For the children. And so the man at the right, who is a self-portrait of Jan Steen, the guy in the black hat, is handing the pipe to the kid, and the kid is going to play the song based on the sorts of behaviors that he sees the others do. And as you can tell, they're just a drunken load of riffraff, right? I mean, they're well dressed and everything, but boy, are they trashed, right? And holding that glass up and pouring it from a height, right? What sorts of things are they teaching their children? Okay. Now, that actual theme doesn't have anything to do with the Mount, right? Mount's picture is not about teaching children, but it is, like Jan Steen's picture, an image that uses humor as a part of projecting its message. Right? Now, there are other artists, I think, that are much closer to the spirit of William Sidney Mount. Van Ostade, who we just looked at with that cottage scene, the cottage dooryard scene, also did a lot of tavern interiors that have a sort of similar feel, sort of warm and convivial, maybe less directed at a single patron as being a pain in the ass, as Mount's is, but give us that sense of a sort of a rural tavern that's well kept, right, well maintained, and is a place that's not a bad place to hang out. Play cards, although cards, and there are cards in his hat, are often a warning against improper behaviors, right? But these certainly seem to have a very, very strong impact on Mount's work, looking back at Dutch works from the 17th century. And I haven't seen it mentioned in print, but for me, the closest analogy is this guy named David Teniers, who studied in Holland under Ostade and then moved to Flanders and to Antwerp, and paints a lot of tavern scenes that have put the figures in almost exactly the same proximity to us in these simplified country interiors, and again use humor as a directive, right? Humor as a corrective, if you will. Negative examples of behavior. Getting so drunk that you go pee in the corner, the guy in the background, right? And Mount's images are, I think, very, very similar in spirit to these. Right? So Mount sets the stage for genre painting, and Bingham picks up that ball. right, and runs with it. He's a major influence on Bingham's on Bingham's development. So if we go back to Bingham, right, that was a little tangent there. The interesting thing about this picture and Bingham is knowing something about Bingham's life. He was a member of the Whig Party. Does anybody heard of the Whigs before? American history, right? Prior to the GOP, right? Is that right? Do I have that part right? They were sort of the conservative movement in American politics prior to the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party wasn't particularly conservative at the beginning, right? They were Lincoln, right? They were Teddy Roosevelt, which are these days liberal causes, right? But right, the GOP starts when, like 1850s or so, right? For the Republican Party, the Whigs are earlier. They obviously don't exist anymore. But they were one of the strongest supporters as a political party of Manifest Destiny. That was one of their causes, right? A platform in the Whig Party politics was westward expansion and the importance of it for the American identity. Right? And when we think about the fact that Bingham was a Whig and a fairly devoted Whig, right? And the idea that he would have thus supported Manifest Destiny. Can we then look at his pictures and find elements that suggest that, yes, this is what he's interested in, is the idea of westward expansion? Well, in the back of the picture, if we look back behind that gnarly tree, we find cattle being raised. Husbandry was a particularly white man thing. The natives didn't raise animals on the farm. They hunted, right? So this becomes a sign of American progress. This becomes a sign of westward expansion. The presence of the white man signaled through the presence of cattle. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Another interesting detail to consider when we think about Bingham's political leanings are the group of people at the doorway. An older fellow listening, a man talking to him in a red vest, a woman leaning out from the split doorway, the Dutch doorway, as they're engaged in conversation. Part of this is simply to establish this as an idyllic place out west, right? Either family or neighbors getting together, having the kind of time, to shoot the breeze that we just don't have, right? Because you got to go from A to B, you got to go from here to there. And so that's certainly added for that. But this sort of grouping of three figures around leaning in and listening and talking is something that Bingham uses a lot in his genre scenes. And usually they are political scenes. They are scenes of political discourse in the countryside. And this is a theme that Bingham picked up, particularly increasingly so by the end of the 40s and into the 1850s. Political discourse in the countryside. Right? And so this is a country politician making the circuit, if you will, explaining his ideas to people. It's very grassroots, right? Just go out and chat people up, right? I guess it's the political rally, but with only 3 or 4 people, right? That's what politics was in rural areas, was really person to person and small scale. Now, the interesting thing about this, for the political overtones of the potential of this conversation being sort of mucking around in issues of the day, is that Bingham actually served in the Missouri House of Representatives. He was elected to public office in 1848. He had run once before, he'd been defeated, he ran a second time and won. He's one of the few artists in the history of American art, for sure, that actually had a successful political career, right? So he's painting on the side while he's serving in the state Congress, right? In the Missouri, not the Washington, right? The Missouri House of Representatives. So if we take that knowledge of A, his Whig status, and B, the fact that he's a practicing politician, then these images take on a certain nuance that they might not have had otherwise, especially the later ones, where they are about the importance of political debate, political participation, maybe better than debate, as a hallmark of America, right? A hallmark of our democracy is this. And after being elected to Congress, he set about a series of paintings that were all about the political process. Large paintings, they're all still in St. Louis, that were painted with the intention that they would be turned into engravings and be distributed. Right? So he hires a professional engraver to make a print after his composition. And that professional engraver takes into account the reversal process of printing. And then the prints are hand colored, right? So it's printed with black and white ink, like most engravings would be, but then they would come back and hand tint them with watercolor, right? And so the National Gallery has a print after the country election, the original painting in St. Louis. Now, here, what Bingham said he wanted to illustrate was the fact that American democracy transcended class difference, right? And so he says, I set it outside rather than inside because I want to show the openness of the system, right? The transparency of American democracy, right? Things don't happen behind closed doors. Things happen for everyone to see. And there's this blue banner on a lance or pole that's leaning up against the house right in the middle, right? And on it, it says, the will of the people, the supreme law, right? So that sets the theme for both of these. This is the will of the people. Right? All of the different social classes gathered together, right? Universality. Everybody can vote. Well, every man, right? Because it's still the 19th century, after all. And he even includes, again, humorous vignettes around this. The kids playing Skittles in their bare feet in the foreground. But also look at the guy at the table on the left, drunk as a skunk, right? That's happening as part of the process, is that they're not against serving booze. Get them to show up at the polls. Think of how we could do. We poll at about 50% if we're lucky, right? Sometimes midterm elections is like 25%. What if they gave a free beer with every vote? I should run for office, right? Heck with a turkey and a chicken in every pot. I want a free beer with every vote. And then people would start showing up, right? Serve beer at the polls. And so this guy is in it, right? And if you look directly behind him, somebody else he's being literally picked up off of the table. He's being carried in. And he got to vote, right? And the guy over here looks like he's a little bit worse for wear as well. All of these people are going to vote. It doesn't matter if you're inebriated. The important thing is to participate, right? To take it seriously and do it. And that's, again, genre scenes like this are using humor, right? As an element of that. It's not only Mount that does this, but it's Bingham as well. The second one of these, I'm only going to show you two, there was a series of three, shows the stump speech, right? We still talk about the stump speech, right? When during the process every 4 years when the presidential candidates go out, they're given a stump speech because it's kind of the same darn speech delivered in Omaha or Duluth, right? Or Butte, Montana. But they're out on the stump, we say, because they're out giving these speeches. And the whole point was that originally they were given on a stump, right? That was the elevated rural dais where they would stand. That was their stage, was a stump. So the stump speech raised them for a moment above the listeners. And so here we have a man giving a stump speech, right? A politician. And everybody crowding around to listen. And you'll notice, well, we'll get to that in a second. He's laying out policy on his hand, right? My first action will be this. My second action will be this, right? And around the people are, really? And entertained by it all. It's been noted that the facial features of the man giving the speech, at least in the painted version, is the guy that Bingham ran against for the House of Representatives. Is a portrait of him, the guy that lost to him. And that, in fact, directly behind him is seated Bingham himself as a self-portrait back there. There's a portrait of Bingham there that you can see the sort of the hairline that sets him off. So there are these autobiographical details added as well, right? In other words, that adds a bit of humor because the guy giving the stump speech is going to lose, right? He's the one because Bingham won. So the guy giving the stump speech, and Bingham's waiting his turn, and he's reviewing his notes. And you'll notice that he's even got the board with the hand there, right? He's waiting his turn. He gets to give the next one. He gets to give the rebuttal, and he's writing his speech as the other guy's given his. So I'm going to give it point by point, right? I'm going to give a retort. Being a good politician and listening, right? The other thing that's interesting is that 3 people in the picture are highlighted wearing white. So one of these is the stump speaker, right? Is wearing white, and you can see that the light falls fairly strongly on him. The other one's on the opposite side of the picture, here. And the third one that's highlighted in white is the little kid in the foreground who's doing something there with a basket, right? He's got from this crowd of people 3 people that he's used the composition to isolate. And he actually explained who he meant them to be. He said one is the stump speaker, duh. The fellow on the right with the top hat is the outstanding citizen. And the kid is the small businessman, right? In other words, this is a kid that's sort of selling Kool-Aid or something, right? Making a little bit of money from the gathered people, and he's counting his change in his hand, right? Now, when we look at the 3, we can see that we have 3 different activities, and we might even interpret them as being sort of the 3 ages of America in a way. If the guy giving the stump speech is going to lose, he's the past. Ideas are worn out, right? He's going to be gone with this election cycle. The upstanding citizen listening intently, the present, right? He makes the decision, the informed decision on who to vote for. The kid, the future, right? America's progress, but through the political system. This will probably be the last one we get to today. I love this picture. I just love this picture. It's one of my 3 or 4 favorite pictures in all of the National Gallery. I just think this is fantastic. And they only got it a few years ago. They only picked it up just a few years ago. Many of Bingham's pictures focus on life in St. Louis. Life in the Midwest. Right, along the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, which is where he grew up and where he settled. And our jolly flatboatmen are people who navigate boats up and down the Mississippi and up and down the Missouri to deliver goods. Right? They're commercial sailors, if you will. Right? And arguably, this is maybe his single best picture. For my money, it is. One of 2 or 3 that everybody points to with Bingham. And given that he is a self-taught painter, just keep that in the back of your mind as we look at the details of this. How incredibly well painted it is, his sense of anatomy, his sense of atmospheric perspective, right? His sense of precisely rendered detail is phenomenal for somebody who really didn't do much in the way of formal art training, right? Just self-trained. Now, this one he sent off to the American Art Union in 1846 to be displayed. They bought it right away from him. And they immediately turned to professional printmakers to make copies of it. They made a copy of this for every one of the 10,000 members, right? Part of your membership dues, you got a copy of the Jolly Boatman in print form, right? They wanted it that bad because they knew it would be just that appealing. Now what we have is a series of boatmen relaxing, right? Not working. They've rowed their way upstream. They've loaded their cargo. And now they're going to drift back down. Right? So the hard work is over. Right? And we see that as they navigate the river, drifting with the current, the oars are out of the water. They establish that wonderful horizontal across the composition. And they're just now drifting. And since they don't have to do any hard work like they would going upstream, they're relaxing, right? And that charm of the relaxation, the humor of that is what I think really comes through, right? Attention to detail, right? We see the pelts that are stored under the arch of the roof of the boat. There's a raccoon pelt nailed to the pediment of the boat. The rope, where you can see the winding in the rope as it comes down. I love that guy's shoe, right? Broken at the toe up above, but the amazing attention to detail everywhere we look. This shirt that's been hung out to dry. Somebody's jumped into the water, been maybe pushed into the water, and has now hung up their shirt to dry. Put a rock on it to hold it there. Part of me I wanted to point to you with this and see it with another detail as well. Like the nails in the wood, right? But you'll notice that you can still see the edge of the roof of the boat under the shirt, right? He hasn't planned it all out when he starts. He's adding things to it as he's working, right? Because if you knew that was going to be there from the get-go, you wouldn't bother to spend the time to paint stuff underneath it. You'd leave it empty and come back in and fill that part in, right? And we might even know through X-ray that it was already drawn there. But Bingham is just sort of like, as he's working, this is a pretty big piece, right? It's not like yay. As he's working, he starts adding stuff to it to make it more interesting, to make it more fun, more charming. Right? And we know that by the way in which the paint has gone transparent everywhere, right? That he didn't reserve a space for it on the canvas. He wasted paint, right? Because he changed his mind while he was working on it. A detail that's pretty easy to miss is the turkey sticking his head out between the slats there, right? By the man that's leaning and watching this dancer perform. And you can see it too has been painted at the very last minute, right? And so that the darkness behind it is faded through the turkey's neck. And the board on the front of it is also faded through. Just amazing. The stains on the nails, right? And the highlight that hits the side of the wood, right? And even how the wood is kicked up around the nails. It's just, and this guy, self-taught, right? Primarily a self-taught painter. Incredible. Boatman had a reputation as being rather vulgar. We still talk, we always say talking like a sailor, right? Same thing was with the boatmen. They were loud, they were vulgar, they were kind of disgusting. That is not what Bingham sees them as, right? Bingham sees them as a celebration. This is looks like the most welcoming place. The guy that's looking out at us, he's not standoffish at all, right? He's just looking out at us. It's like, come on and join in. And it seems like it would be a fun place to be. Right? Great details, right? You can hear the music, right, as the guy looks out at us, And where are we? We're in the middle of the water, and he's still sort of watching us almost, right? And there's no way that we're where he's looking. But directly behind the violin player and into it, right? And you can tell Bingham is into it, right? This is what he grew up around. He's seen these people since he was a kid. I kind of like that stoic fellow in the background with the red hat, right? But tapping his toe as they're playing their music. The kid on the left with this great little smile, makeshift, right? He's just got a skillet or a tin pan, and bang, dang, dang, dang. He's giving it a little bit of percussion to go with the music as the guy up top gives us the river dance, right, if you will, bouncing on it. He takes this scene and he arranges it in this amazing isosceles pyramid of sort of stabilizing. And placing these figures within a triangle like this reminds us of classical architecture and the Greek heroes that usually appeared in the pediments above a Greek temple. This is the copy of the Parthenon that's in Nashville, right? The Parthenon from Greece, but there's a copy in Nashville. seemed like a good analogy, where we can see the figures arranged within the pyramid by different poses. Bingham is making them into mythical heroes, right, on the open waters. There's quite a few of these kinds of images of life on the river, because this is what he grew up with. But these were, in fact, very important to westward expansion. These waterways were our very first interstate highways. The boatmen were like 18-wheeler drivers, right? They were responsible for the shipment of goods to the different settlements up and down the Mississippi and the Missouri. They ferried supplies all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to the mouth of the Yosemite River, right? Or the Yellowstone River, up and down the Midwest. But at the time that Bingham is painting, in the 1840s, this mode of transportation was dying. Steamships had replaced the flatboats. We see a steamship in the background here, one of the flatboats relieving them as they've gotten stuck, right? The flatboats never get stuck. They've got no draw underneath, right? And Bingham's pictures are nostalgic, right? They take us back to a time when these sorts of boats were really the boats that you saw on the river. But by the 1840s, that was not the case, right? This is a nostalgic picture for a lost way of life, but an important one because the opening of the Mississippi and the Missouri were crucial for the westward expansion movement. And that's what we'll look at next, right? We're going to look at some Indian art, probably after the break, and we'll look at some artists that benefited from these travels up and down the Mississippi and the Missouri and the push westward when we're down at the museum on Friday, right? So be sure before Friday that you check your emails, right? Because if I can't get it worked out, I'll let you know. And if I can get it worked out, I'll let you know, right? I'll give you the details on where to meet if we get it all worked out. And if it doesn't work out, then I will let you know by email that we'll just meet here in class, okay? And based on that, I'll also update the slide list, and I'll let you know when that's done as well. Okay? So I will see you on Friday here or there.